All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Hope everyone's doing okay amidst everything going on, the craziness. So we're just going to jump right into it. Not going to do too much of an introduction or anything. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to give really quickly just kind of an overview of what the day will look like for everyone. Hopefully you got the agenda that I sent out, but we're going to start right now with one of our two workshops, which is called Conducting Effective Land Use Reviews. We should wrap up for a lunch break around 12:30 or so. We're going to have a break or two in between then to get up and stretch and maybe have a snack or whatever you need. And we are going to have designated time for Q&As. So rather than have kind of live question and answer as we go, we're going to have a dedicated slot for that in the middle and toward the end. So we'll have two. But feel free to just submit questions via either the Q&A option at the bottom or even the chat would be okay. And we will get to those during the designated Q&A times. These presentations will be made available to you right after each workshop. I'm going to email them right after via PDF. So you don't need to try and take a bunch of crazy notes or anything. Do feel free to take notes if it helps you, but you will be getting these presentations basically as soon as we're done. In addition to that, the session is being recorded and will be sent out to everybody after the event. So you'll have it in full that way as well. We have 4 presenters today. We're going to have 2 folks running the show for the first workshop, and the second workshop, which starts at 1 p.m., we'll have another 2 presenters. And I'm going to let them each introduce themselves pretty fully as they get going. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nancy Hess, and she'll be kicking us off.
All right, good morning, everyone. And I want to thank you all for signing in today. Both GrowSmart and myself from the Rhode Island Division of Planning think the work that you do for your communities is extremely important. And we are disappointed we couldn't do this in person this year, but we want to do something for you. So my name is Nancy Hess. I am the supervising land use planner for the Rhode Island Department of Administration Division of Statewide Planning. It's a very long name, but we're the centralized planning agency for the state. And I pretty much do a little bit of everything. I've been with the state for about 20 years. Prior to that, I served in several municipal planning departments as the planning director, mostly in South County. I've also worked in the private engineering sector and had a little bit of experience working for the federal government. I also volunteer as a planning board member for my own community. So I like to tell people that I can bring the perspective of wearing many hats to what we're talking about today. So the first workshop that we're going to focus on this morning is called Conducting Effective Land Use Reviews. And this workshop is pretty much a background, is going to give you some of the reasons and what we are doing and why your job is so important and some of the tools to help you do it better. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about us, the Land Use Training Collaborative, go over the workshop goals for this morning, talk about your legal power and responsibility. Then we will take a break, and Amy Gowan from Celur will come in and talk about the land use review process. Along the way, we will try to provide you informational resources and more training opportunities will be developed as we figure out what happens in the future with the pandemic. So the Rhode Island Land Use Training Collaborative is led by the Division of Statewide Planning and GrowSmart Rhode Island, and the purpose is to provide land use planning information and law to municipal officials. And there are a bunch of public and private partners. Like I said, the Division of Planning where I work, Grow Smart Rhode Island, where CJ, who you saw first, works. There's a lot of other organizations involved, the Interlocal Risk Management Trust, the Rhode Island chapter of the American Planning Association. And today we have Andy and Amy from Ursillo, Tights and Rich, the law office, and Carolyn Wells from Weston and Sampson. And I want to give a shout out to those other trainers, Carolyn, Amy, and Andy today. They are volunteering, and we greatly appreciate the donation of their time for this very important event today. I also have to give a shout out to the Federal Highway Administration and the state of Rhode Island. They provided the funding for this event today. So the goals of the workshop for today are 4 things. We want to provide local officials with the knowledge and skills to make informed decisions about land use choices. We want to make sure you understand what your legal obligations are to follow what the state mandates in law. And we want to explain due process and make sure that you are avoiding any potential costs to communities that might arise in legal fees and increases in insurance to the municipality. The work that you all do as a board is all the work that happens after the community comprehensive plan has been adopted and ordinance and regulations that carry out that plan have been adopted. How you do land use reviews through your decisions and terminations will be determined the future of your community and how things will line up and be consistent with the comprehensive plan. So why take this workshop today? There's several benefits, not only as you as a board member, but to your community. We want to make sure that you are reflecting the community's goals for the future development. You can establish credibility for your public body. Decisions will not be challenged, or if they are challenged, they will hold up on appeal. Avoid cost to your municipality, as I mentioned, in the form of judgments or municipal legal fees, and also protecting your own reputation and the reputations of other members of your board, body, staff, and the people you deal with. So making sure that things are done in a clear fashion, making sure they're done in a professional way, and they're legal defensively are basically the 3 ideas this workshop is based on. Okay, so that's a little bit of what we're going to cover and why it's important. So we're going to go into roles and responsibilities that you as a board member, whether you're a planning board, a zoning board, historic commission, or another board that comes from a municipality. We primarily focus on planning and zoning boards since they do a large number of the reviews. So your legal power and responsibility is, the purpose of it is to protect the public interest. And the public interest is what affects the general welfare of the community as a whole. And it's important to justify governmental regulations. It is protected by enacting comprehensive plans, zoning ordinances, and other regulations enforcing those regulations over time. The area of public interest for which you are responsible is land use. You adopt the plans and enforce the ordinances and the regulations that determine how the land use in your community and your municipal borders will be allocated for different uses, and the standards that must be met for a property owner to receive municipal approval to develop land or to make changes to property to comply with the ordinances in your comprehensive plan. So that's why, the big why behind all these state laws and local ordinances and comp plans exist. So where does this power come from? The power comes from, basically it flows down from the top. It starts with the federal government. The federal government delegates power to the states via the Constitution and federal laws. The state then does the same and delegates power to municipalities. And there are a lot of laws that the state has. We primarily are going to focus on the Comprehensive Planning Act, the Zoning Enabling Act, the Land Development and Subdivision Review Act. The next slide I'll show you has a list of some of the others, though it's not comprehensive. And if you're curious about all the others, I'll give you a resource webpage where you can look that information up a little bit later after we finish this particular session in the morning. The municipality, the city and town, or the mayor will appoint boards and commissions, and many of you have been appointed to boards and commissions. The legal authority is given to boards provided by state law, municipal charters, and/or local ordinances that create your boards and commissions. So then the power of the board and the commission is to protect the public interest through land use planning and to administrate the land use regulations and ordinances that you're charged with. So this slide is kind of a summary. On the left is what I call sort of the holy trinity of acts, the three big acts that drive most of what land use planners do: the Comp Plan Act, the zoning ordinances, which we call the Zoning Enabling Act, and the subdivision of land, which we also call the Subdivision Enabling Act. On the right side, you can see other laws related to planning, formulation of local planning boards or commissions, enabling to have joint municipal planning boards. If you had a project that was on the border of two communities, they could form a very unique joint board to review that project. There's an impact fee act, and then there's some other very specific acts that give a community's authority to do things like map streets, historic area zoning, for those of you who may be on historic district zoning commissions, wastewater management districts, soil erosion and sediment control, and the Low and Moderate Income Housing Act, just to kind of highlight some of the real biggies that are also out there in Rhode Island general law. And again, as we close for the morning, I'll show you the Division of Planning's webpage where you can find resources on how to look up some of these other acts. All right, so that's where the power comes from. So I talked about powers and responsibility, and I'm going to focus on your legal responsibility. So the power to regulate land use comes with the responsibility to provide due process. And what is due process? Due process is basically you have to be fair. Due process is a term set for established legal principles derived from federal and state constitutions, statutes, and case law that ensure that fair treatment of citizens by federal and state local governments. It ensures that government will treat individuals fairly and does not abuse its power by acting in an arbitrary or capricious manner. And there are two types of due process. One is substantive, which is based on law, and the other is procedural, which is notice and opportunity to be heard. And we'll get into more detail this afternoon on the two types of due process in the Making Sound Decisions workshop. That'll start at 1 p.m. And I always like to throw this little guy in. I'm a superhero fan, so with great power comes great responsibility. And Spidey's just there to remind us that. So the due process creates certain responsibilities to protect the rights of individuals in the community. And this slide is kind of split into two sides. On the right is the individuals, and on the left is the communities. They're basically similar responsibilities to both parties. The first one is that you must, for the individual, notify that the body is considering taking action that could affect their public and/or private interest. An individual must be provided an opportunity to be heard and make decisions based on standards for review and facts of the record if an individual has an application pending. On the community side, the community must make sure that they are providing the opportunities to be heard. They must notify the public. They must make the decisions based on review, and they must make decisions consistent with the comprehensive community plan. So how do you do this? You've gone over where your power comes from and your responsibility and your responsibility to provide due process. You all as boards act through public meetings. So what is a public meeting? The public meeting is the convening of a public body to discuss and work on, and act on matters underneath the jurisdiction of a board or a commission. Meetings include many things. They could be a workshop, and they could be a working session. They could also be a public hearing. And just a note to point out that public hearings are unique creatures. Not every meeting is a public meeting. And public meetings are interesting items. You as boards and commissions may be familiar with them, but the people who come from the populations of your communities aren't. So this is why we're giving you this information so that you're familiar with the why and how you do your job to better able to explain it to the people who come to your meetings. You as a public body basically are any board created by the express authority of the state or the municipal government. And by state laws, the public body must provide a notice, agenda, and keep minutes available. And we'll get a little bit more into the Open Meetings Act in a little bit. And the public is any person who wants to attend or participate in a meeting. So the Open Meetings Act, Rhode Island General Law, is another state law that makes requirements of public bodies. And basically, the law requires several things. Meetings must be open. Meetings must provide notice, and meetings must keep a record of what is being discussed. And under the notice category, there are two requirements. You have to do an annual notice, which means you must post every meeting you think you're going to have for the year with the Secretary of State. And then you must do a supplemental notice. And the supplemental notice is for each and every meeting that you have, must be posted a minimum of 48 hours in advance, which excludes weekends and holidays. And we'll get a little bit into agendas and notices and what minimal content should be in a few minutes. There's a great reference on the Rhode Island Attorney General's website, and you'll have this link after we send you the PDF at the end of the morning. There's a book that's probably about 40 to 50 pages that will describe open meetings in much more detail than us if you're interested, or you can always seek the advice of your municipal solicitor. So notice requirements under the Open Meetings Act. There are basically two kinds of requirements. One is the general notice required by Open Meetings Law, and then there are other notice requirements specifically by those two enabling statutes that I mentioned earlier. The zoning enabling statute and the subdivision enabling statute may require more specific notice than the general notice. So your regularly scheduled meetings must be posted on the Secretary's website at the beginning of each calendar year and must include the date, time, and place of meetings. And generally, we'll mention some of these items will be handled by your planning staff, but it's good for you as board and commissioners to understand what things need to be done and why, so you know how your meetings are being conducted, and what all the background effort is to keep it so that you don't get challenged on your decisions. Your supplemental written public notice must be posted at least 48 hours in advance of each meeting, does not include Saturdays and Sundays or holidays, must include the date, time, place, and nature of businesses, and must be posted in 2 locations, and usually this is done by staff. And I do want to throw sort of a little footnote out there. Much of this was sort of drafted before the pandemic. So we will try to chime in when the pandemic has created some different and more recent practices. But right now, this PowerPoint does focus on what the general laws require. And Amy Gowans will kind of chime in when she sees something based on her experience as a municipal solicitor in South Kingstown from what they've been practicing recently.
Sure.
So go ahead, Amy.
And this is Amy Goins. I'll chime in quickly now. Everyone knows that remote meetings are now allowed for public bodies by Governor Raimondo's executive order. The 48-hour notice requirement has not been changed.
Okay, thanks, Amy. So the other supplemental notice required is that you must give more detailed notice for meetings and hearings, including the specific timing for these notices. Notice must appear in a local newspaper and must be sent to applicant, property owners within the legal notice area, or what we call the abutters that you've identified, who might have a public or a private interest in the application. Other interested parties are required under state law. And this could be watershed councils if you have them in your community, and or drinking water suppliers in your community. And also neighboring towns must receive notice as well if a proposed application area of notice would cross the municipal border. While not required, many municipalities, and under the pandemic, we are now seeing this as a more common practice, is regularly scheduled meetings are on the municipal websites. And generally, municipal staff handles the details of this, but it's good to know what's happening to get your meeting to happen. So we're going to go through a few things where we just wanted to give you some, not to pick on anyone, but some examples of what might be good and what not be so good to use. This is a not exemplary notice. This had appeared in one of the local papers. I clipped it. This comes from the community of Providence. The Committee on Ordinances is having a meeting, and this was going to be in 2018. And they list the time and they list the council chamber. It's on the 3rd floor. And this is the agenda for that meeting. There was going to be a petition from Nicholas J. Hammond, Esquire, from a law firm, and it gives the law firm's address in Providence. And the petition was to request a zone change on various lots from M-MU75 back to an M1 zone. And this was posted by the Committee on Ordinances. So the reason why we say this is not exemplary, because what are the details of the project? Can you tell anything from that little tiny description that's written there? What's the zone change? What's the land uses? What is MUU75? What is an M1 zone? Where are the lots? What's the street location? Where and how can you see plans for this? What are the policies that this committee will follow in making decisions for this particular application? And it's on the 3rd floor. So what's the accessibility information? So these points are why we say this is not exemplary. So here's a better one. And again, this was what we were using before the pandemic. We will, Amy can chime in with what information gets included for remote meetings, but generally here, you have the name of the body, you have the time, the location, you have the agenda items, you have a good description of what the actual application is. You know, preliminary plan of the Green Acres Shopping Mall, proposed 25-acre shopping center, site of the proposed shopping center. It gives the plat and lot, and it gives the location of where these lots are, because many people in the general public don't know what an assessor's plat and lot means. They probably don't even know what their own assessor's plat and lot is. So giving a street location is probably the best general information to include in an agenda description. It tells you detailed plans are available for review in the planning department at the town hall. It also, when you go down to the 3rd circle, it tells you the planning board's policy is to adjourn at 10 p.m. That's very important to know. And it also tells you accessibility information, that if you need an interpreter service, who you must call and how far in advance. Amy, do you want to chime in on some of the things we've added because of remote meeting requirements lately?
But before Amy does that, this is Andy.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I just want to go back to the first notice, not optimal, but just, or not exemplary. A lot of the stuff is nice, but the fact that it didn't tell where the lots were makes it absolutely illegal and invalid. That's really the big sin on this one. Various lots. that they didn't give you some kind of knowledge. All the other stuff, maybe people could take further investigation to find out on themselves. But if they don't know where it is, they don't even know if they should be interested in it. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, and going off that, this is Amy. You can do more with digital notices, or, you know, notices that are uploaded to the Secretary of State's office, you know, maybe emailed to people if they're on the notice list. People can click links. People who are looking at a newspaper notice or getting a mail notice can't do that. So if you intend to reference something outside the actual notice itself, putting in a link may be helpful. And obviously not clickable from hard copy, but someone can access it. Going back to what needs to be included in a notice, we've seen different examples of notices for remote meetings. Generally, you want to have the Zoom link. Sometimes municipalities will publish notices for public hearings in a newspaper. They might not have the Zoom link available at that point, but as long as you can say the Zoom link will be posted on, you know, the municipality's website or the website of the planning department by X, you know, date and time, or you can say the Zoom link will be included in the agenda to be posted, you know, 48 hours in advance. I think that's sufficient. As long as it's very clear to people that, you know, they're not showing up at town hall, we need to be sure of that. But the best thing the best practice would be to put the Zoom link in the notice.
Okay, thank you. So I referenced earlier that your agendas need to be posted on the Secretary of State's website. And for resource purposes, we've included a quick snapshot of the Secretary of State's website. And this is where the agendas are. You can go in and search for any public body in Rhode Island, whether it's municipal or state. You can also, through this website, you can sign yourself up to get your own agendas, or you can sign yourself up to get notices of agendas for other boards and committees in your community or other communities. Whatever you feel would be of useful information to you. So again, you'll get this after the morning session is over. So moving along, we've gotten you with where your power comes from, your roles and responsibilities, and some tips and pointers about public meetings and the responsibilities that come with them. There are other requirements for public meetings that you do need to be aware of, and staff will help you meet requirements. But a big one is that they must be accessible, and it's not only accessible whether or not people may need an interpreter, but it's also accessible for people with disabilities. So the rooms in which a public meeting is held must be accessible. But you also must meet fire code regulations, and you never think about that until you have a crowd. So we've got some recommendations that are coming up on how to conduct your public meetings and some of the physical requirements for it. So these are some best practices that we've gathered over the years that we've been doing these training sessions. And I just want to throw out there that the Land Use Training Collaborative has been around since about 2004. And we've trained hundreds of municipal officials just like you. And we've gathered tips that we have either professionally found ourselves or have come in from participants like yourselves over time. So if you have anything you have found particularly helpful to you, please feel free to type it into the chat room, and we will share that with all once the recording is made available for everybody. So some of these practices are to try and make the meetings flow professionally, efficiently, and make sure that everyone can participate. So they seem kind of basic, but sometimes basics need good reinforcement. So have a podium with a microphone at the front of the room. Make sure you have microphones for all your board members. And a suggestion has been made is have the nameplates for the board members, commission, and staff, because you as a board and your staff know who you are, but someone from the public who's coming to a public meeting for the very first time and may never come to a meeting again, they don't know who you are. So the nameplates are helpful. Make sure the presentation space and the visual aids that are used are visible to all. In a lot of places, the engineers and the applicants come with a podium and they put a board on it with the plans and everything. We are moving more into the digital aid of having things on screens. Make sure the screens are visible not only to the boards themselves, but also to the public. Make sure you have comfortable accommodations. And this is more than having easy chairs and office chairs for the board and commissions to sit in themselves. This is making sure that your room has proper air conditioning, heating, venting, cooling. If you expect a large turnout for a big public hearing on a project that may or may not generate controversy, and you're going to be holding the meeting in August, we really suggest you make sure you have an air-conditioned room to hold that in. The board that I volunteer for, our backup room for large meetings is actually our elementary school cafeteria. It does not have air conditioning, so we generally try to avoid large meetings in August if that's possible. A few things that make people happy in the audience is extra agendas, so they can follow along as to they know what's coming up and they know when the item they're interested in will be heard by the board. A couple of things about running the meeting. Make sure you start on time, follow the agenda. Jumping around between things on the agenda generally confuses people. Explain the process when you open the meeting. Like I said, many people they don't even go to town hall these days. They pay everything remotely, through credit cards or bill payment services. They may be in town hall for the very first time. They don't know what's going to happen, but set things out and let them know what to expect. Also explain your rules of conduct, that you will not tolerate interruptions, you will not tolerate shouting, clapping is generally discouraged. As I said before, introduce yourselves. Make sure you have a backup plan for overcrowding. If you have something that's impacting a great number of individuals or the community, or you have something people feel very strongly pro or con about, make sure you know the fire capacity of your room. Make sure you have someone keeping track of that. Some communities may request their town sergeant or assistance from the police department with an officer for that. There are times where if you exceed the fire capacity of your room, you will have to have a backup and either relocate or reschedule the meeting. And we've also run into, Amy and Andy, if you want to talk about what may be coming down the road with the Rhode Island reopen requirements for the pandemic, we can get into that as well. Let me finish this slide. Having a good chairman is an effective to running very fair and consistent public meetings. Your chairman has to be firm but fair. Your chairman is someone who can summarize what's going along, make sure people aren't repeating themselves. If you start getting comments that are of the same nature and the same issue, that the chairman can summarize and let people know they're being heard, but they're talking about something that people in common feel strongly. Don't get into rhetorical questions. If you're conducting a meeting or a hearing, it's not a debate. You're there to find out information, to make a decision on an application. And when looks like you're finishing up something, be clear on what the next steps are. And the general public, they don't know the process. They want to know what's going to happen next. Summarize, thank them for coming, and again, make sure they know what they can do next and how to follow up. If you're going to continue something, tell them you're continuing it and follow the procedures for doing that. Tell them how they could follow up with the staff if they want more information after the meeting has been adjourned. So I don't know, Andy and Amy, if you want to chime in about anything about meetings you think maybe coming up if we're transitioning from remote back to in-person meetings under the pandemic requirements?
Sure, I'll just say, I think the remote meetings is something that will outlast the pandemic and the state of emergency. I think we will see the law amended to allow for remote participation, if not by members of the board themselves, by the public. So I think the municipalities who have recently had to adapt quickly to this technology change should not assume that it's going to be, you know, just for the next few months. I don't have any inside info on this, but that's my sense.
This is Andy Tights. First of all, that's one of the things we talk about with virtual meetings. Always introduce yourself at the beginning so people know who you're speaking. I don't know if you're seeing a picture of me or not. I'm still seeing a picture of Amy. Either way, one of the things was mentioned about nameplates. And with these virtual meetings, if your computer allows a virtual background with Zoom, we recommend it. If you've seen Amy, you see we've got the firm in the background. I've changed my virtual background now to, right at the moment, that's the East Greenwich Town Hall. But we've done it with several of the towns. We've got a picture of the town hall or the town seal. And we recommend for all the officials, the board members, the secretary, the solicitor, have the same background behind you again. So the people who are just tuning in and watching, and they might be seeing 20 faces on a screen, they don't know who the board members are, who the officials are. If you all have that same official background behind you, that helps them tell at a glance whether you're just one of the members of the public or one of the board members or staff to it.
Okay, I think that's a great tip. And that's an example of something, if you come across something recently with the circumstances that we're all under, and you think it'd be helpful, type it into the chat room and we'll share it with everyone. So one of the things that the community I volunteer for we've done is we've actually developed an advisory guide for public hearings. And went too far ahead. So as I mentioned, the general public, they don't know what's going on. So we developed this in Richmond to hand out when we do a public hearing, because not only are there instructions needed to the public, it's good to have something they have in their hand that they can refer to. So this is something, it's totally voluntary. We put this out with the copies of extra agendas and basically explains the steps that we had said. I just went over what's a public hearing and why do we have them, what happens, how will the hearing be conducted, and we give the details of actual steps, how the chair opens the meetings, who's going to speak and when, and what happens after each person speaks. And then it gives them the instructions on what happens when the hearing is closed, and how to follow up for more information on the town's webpage. So we just found this is kind of helpful, and the people can take it if they want and use it, and it does help meetings flow more efficiently. So now we've gone through basically where your power comes from, your roles and responsibilities, a few things about posting agendas and conducting your public meetings. In order to have a public meeting, you must have something that's called a quorum under state law. And the quorum is the minimum number of members that must be in attendance and voting at a meeting or a hearing in order for business to take place. So the quorum is the set number of members according to state law, the municipal charter, ordinances, regulations, or rules of procedure. And it also, not only is it necessary to conduct the meeting, but it's also necessary to do any votes during the meeting. So we're going to go through a little bit of what quorum requirements are. And they're a little bit different between zoning boards and planning boards per state law. So the zoning boards will be in one color and the planning boards will change to a different color. So as required by state law, the zoning board must have 5 members and 2 alternates. Alternates should attend meetings and they actively participate. An alternate votes if a regular member is absent or recuses themselves. There must be 5 members present to hold the meeting and take a vote on a request. Those 5 members could include an alternate. There must be a simple majority or 3 members to hold the meeting, and no member may vote on a matter unless he or she has attended all hearings concerning that matter. Decisions in favor of an applicant require an affirmative vote by 4 of the 5 members voting. And the zoning board's rules of procedure must state the board's quorum and voting requirements. And a zoning board must have a verbatim record. Anything in there, Andy or Amy, that you want to highlight or comment on before I move on to the requirements for planning boards?
Nope.
Hi, this is Andy. Just a quick thing. So on the verbatim records, that's always pretty much been a stenographer for a zoning board. And it certainly is the best practice. Usually planning boards have gone with tapes. Audio tapes are very hard to create transcripts from because people in normal life don't identify who they are speaking at the beginning each time, like we're trying to get people to do now with the Zoom stuff. Now that everything, particularly with Zoom, is being video recorded, it's actually easier. We've had stenographers. The stenographers do Zoom meetings as well. And the practical tip here is make sure your stenographer is a panelist if you're using a webinar setting, and or if you're forcibly muting people, make sure your stenographer is unmuted, because your stenographer has to be able to interrupt speakers to either tell them to slow down or repeat something, or if multiple people start talking at once, the stenographer's got to be able to chime in. So just that practical thing for Zoom and stenographers.
Okay, thanks. Great tip. And the reminder to our audience that our PowerPoints were created before the pandemic, so we're trying to throw in recent experiences that might be helpful to you. So we'll switch over to state law requirements for planning boards, and that's why we switched colors on the slide. And they're a little bit different than zoning boards. So a planning board shall consist of no less than 5 members. A municipal charter can provide for more members and alternates, and a quorum consists of a simple majority of the membership per the open meetings law, unless the municipal charter provides otherwise. And a decision to approve a land development or subdivision request requires votes for approval by a majority of the current membership of the planning board, and a member may vote on a matter even if he or she has not attended all meetings concerning the matter. The planning board's rules of procedure should state the board's quorum and voting requirements. Any differences there, Amy or Andy, you want to stress for the audience?
Nope.
All right. So going back to the other requirements and the requirements under the Open Meetings Act, it was that the meeting had to be open, it had to be posted, and you had to keep a record. And records are usually referred to as the meeting minutes. The minutes are the record of the body itself, and every public body must have a process for maintaining copies of the minutes. And usually this is a staff function, but it's good to know why you're required to have minutes. The required contents are minimal: date, time, place of meeting, members present and absent, agenda items discussed, the record of any vote taken, and any other relevant information that a body member may ask to have included. The legal requirements for the availability of minutes is also set by state law, and it means you must have a listing by member of the votes taken at a meeting available within 2 weeks after the meeting. So what did you decide on and who voted what way must be available within 2 weeks. A draft of the minutes must be available 35 days after the meeting or the next regularly scheduled meeting, whichever is earlier. Approved minutes must be available after approval, and the approved minutes must be posted on the Secretary of State's website. And again, planning staff usually handles a lot of these details, but as a board and commission members, I keep repeating, it's very good for you to understand the background of many of these tools and items and processes that create the job function that you do for your community. A best practice tip, though we've seen it become much more common, is many communities use the service called ClerkBase for accessing their meeting agendas and materials from their local website. So the records of the public body are subject to the Rhode Island Access to Public Records Act. This is another state law that is relevant to you as a board and commissioner. The principle behind this law is that public documents must be available to the public. The public has a right to get copies of records, and they have a right to petition if access to a document is denied. The Rhode Island Attorney General website also has a great booklet about this because it's a very important, significant topic for the state. Public bodies must have written procedures and policies on how someone would request access to documents. They must have printed copies of their policies and procedures available. Keep written minutes of all their meetings. They must provide copies, though they may charge reasonable fees for the reproduction of the copies. And as mentioned before, approved minutes must be posted on the Secretary of State's website. So rules of procedure and bylaws is something I mentioned. They are required for zoning boards. They are recommended for planning boards. But what are they? They're the basic written provisions for how you're going to do your business. Their purpose is to promote fairness, but also to make sure people understand how the board is going to operate and what are they going to do for certain things. Typically, they contain provisions for how public bodies may elect officers, when they may conduct their elections and how frequently. What are the procedures of a meeting? What will be on the agenda? What will be the order of items on the agenda? How will the body conduct hearings? And how will they handle testimony? So it's basically the rules to conduct an effective meeting. All right, so we've gone over where your power comes from, your roles and responsibilities, lots of stuff about public meetings and little details and best practices tips to try and keep things running efficiently, differences between planning and zoning boards. And again, you'll get this PowerPoint after the morning is over. Some of the things about minutes and rules of procedure and your bylaws, but you as a public official have a responsibility to conduct yourself in an ethical way. So we're going to go a little bit into ethics and ethical behavior and some tips on conducting yourself in a proper fashion. So ethics are basically moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conduct of an activity. And it is the policy of Rhode Island, as stated in the general laws, that public officials and employees must adhere to the highest standards of ethical conduct and respect the trust and the rights of all persons to be open, accountable, and responsive, and avoid the appearance of impropriety and not use their position for private gain or advantage. And there's the Rhode Island general law reference for that. So basically what we want to focus on, what we think is the biggest problem for boards and commissions, although there's many, ex parte communications is something that seems to have come up very often in workshops in the past, in past discussions. And what are they? I mean, it's a kind of a funny word, ex parte. Ex parte communications are when something happens and there's three parts to it. A public official is contacted by an individual or a group with an interest in the outcome of an application. And number two, a public official is contacted outside a public meeting. So generally you may be on your own when this happens. And there's an attempt to influence or secure a public official's vote or an opinion. Be very wary. Ex parte communications are difficult to identify. Some things may be innocent and some things may not. We've always talked when we've done our workshops in person. If you think something might wind you up on the front of the Providence Journal or in one of the news stories saying you paid for it, you probably want to steer away from having that conversation or communication. So we've got a couple scenarios to explain what we mean. Some real innocent things that might happen to you and are very common, and we've talked about these in workshops in the past. So the first one is you're a member of a zoning board and you're considering a variance request. So you go out and do a site inspection. Okay, that's common. You know, lots of boards and officials do that. Lots of boards do it together. Lots of boards do it individually. You stop by a property on a Saturday morning to look at it, and you're standing by your car at the edge of the property, and the next door neighbor notices you, and he comes over, you know, and there they are having a talk, you know, over the fence, and he says he can't be at the hearing, but he wants to give you the point of view of the project. What do? Now, normally when we have our in-person workshops, we have like a 5-minute conversation about this, and everyone's able to chime up and put in their input. So our suggestion is the response to this type of scenario should be to instruct the individual to submit their comments in writing to the planning office so they can be included as part of the record. You can't discuss something outside of the public meeting, but the people certainly can send their opinion in either by email or as a letter to the office to be shared with the whole board. All right, the next scenario we found was a super common one, and some of you may have experienced this. You're a member of a planning board and you're scheduled to decide on a proposed comp plan amendment requested by a developer for a senior assisted living facility to build. You have a chance meeting in the grocery store. There's the two people involved, and the woman on the right is saying to the woman on the left, Susan, you're on the planning board. I've been reading in the paper about that proposed assisted living facility off of Green Street. I think it sounds like something we really need here in town. What do you think? Kind of seems like a harmless, innocent question, but again, you're outside of your public body's meeting and you shouldn't discuss it. So what we recommend the response be is that you inform the individual you cannot discuss the application outside of the meeting. Tell them to contact the planning office for the date, time, and location of the hearing on the project. The other item under ethics in ex parte communication that we wanted to talk about was dealing with email. And email communications can get you into trouble very quickly. So things to remember: contact made outside a normal meeting intended to influence should be avoided. Emails to board members, from applicants, or to the public are considered ex parte communications. So if you get one, what do? Disclose that you've received it at a public meeting and have the materials in the email entered into the record. Something we recommend and we talked about in workshops is that once you get the email, send it to your planning staff and ask them to include it in the record and share it with the board. What can get you into trouble very quickly is you could create a virtual meeting through email. Emails amongst board members at risk create a virtual meeting, and this would violate the open meetings law. To avoid this, never hit reply all. No reply all. If you need to communicate to all members of a public body, we recommend using the blind copy or the BCC function. This eliminates the possibility a member can reply all and innocently and inadvertently start a virtual meeting. Another recommendation that we have is to keep your email communications separate, is to create a separate account and address for your town business, not your personal email account. Some people, they share emails and they share accounts between family members, and we're recommending that perhaps you separate that so that inadvertently a family member couldn't actually reply all and get you in trouble. Anything you want to say about this one, Andy? I know this is one of your favorite topics.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, first of all, about the second part, family use a separate email, because sometimes towns and board members get sued, and aggressive attorneys for developers that are suing you may seek to get possession of your hard drive and all your emails in discovery. So it's a lot better if you have a totally separate email account and can say, no, I don't have, it's not on any of my private ones. You don't have any right to my private computer's hard drive. And then again, as you said about the blind copy, the problem that it creates a virtual meeting, or also the rolling quorum is the thing. And it happens totally innocently. I've seen it where the first email is just for scheduling, where it's permitted. And staff sends out an email and says, we want to go visit the Smith farm. Which of the following Saturday mornings are you available? That's the first one. And that's perfectly acceptable to send by email to all the members. And then one member sends back, well, I'm only available the first Saturday of the month, but why are we doing the site visit? I thought that was all high and dry. And then another member chimes in and says, oh no, the southwest corner is all wetlands. We've got to take a look at it. Suddenly you have a substantive discussion of the issues happening outside of the public view. So that's why it's better not to give people the opportunity to inadvertently start those kind of discussions. They might deliberately, but then that's their problem. But at least inadvertently, if you blind copy them, they can only reply to staff, and staff will have those comments, but that won't create a rolling quorum.
This is Amy. I'll just say keep in mind, this applies to social media too. So you want to avoid, right? If somebody posts on the local Facebook group, you know, a post about come out to the planning board meeting and, you know, on whatever topic, a comp permit, a big proposed shopping center in a rural part of town, you don't want to be commenting on those posts because if someone else on the planning board does, and if more and more people start either liking it. So just keep that in mind too. Social media is another area where board members can potentially get into trouble.
Good point, Amy. And also, it can also be, there's another thing besides ex parte communication, which is bias. You don't want someone to accuse you of bias, which is really part of this whole ex parte, whether you meet them in the supermarket or on Facebook. If someone is trying to push you into what do you think about it, your response as a board or commission member is always going to be, I've got to keep an open mind. I can't talk to you about it. And if someone's talking to you in a personal setting and saying, but Charlie, you're my best friend, why can't you talk to me about it? And saying, well, you don't want me to, if you think I might favor it because you're my best friend, you don't want me to have to be recused because you talk to me about it, do you? And sometimes that's a nice way to turn people down when you can't talk to them. One exception is if you're a town council member or a city council member. Legally, people have the right to approach you and tell you what they think you should do. And practically, if you blow them off too quickly, you're never going to be reelected. So again, advice is listen to them politely for about a minute and then say, well, you know, I really have to keep an open mind and I can't be talking about it only in the hearing. It's just really a matter of degree, but the same answer. You can't really talk to them about it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Great advice and tips. And I always find, even when I'm a trainer presenting these workshops, I always learn something new from my fellow trainers. So we've got a couple examples of some emails that were like actual circumstances, but we've changed the names to protect the innocent on the emails. And this particular one, hide my videos. There's a proposed subdivision off of Green Street. And the email comes into M. Smith, and he's on the East Borough Planning Board. And the subject is the subdivision off of Green Street. And the email comes from someone who seems to know the planning board person very well. And it says, "Hi, Mary. I know the planning board is going to be meeting about the proposed subdivision off of Green Street. Our house lot backs onto that parcel, and my neighbors and I are really concerned that there's going to be a huge drainage problem. I strongly feel that you and the other board members should turn that proposal down cold. Why don't you and Jim come over for coffee tomorrow evening, and I'll show you what we're worried about. Best wishes, Jane Jones." Okay, sounds, kind of, innocent and friendly and building on a relationship that these people have, but this is ex parte communication. So how should this board member respond? And here's our recommendation. Reply to the email and CC your town planner staff and state the following. So you're replying to, the individual at their address. In the CC line, you've got the town planner. Dear Jane, I'm not at liberty to discuss land use review applications with the public outside of a public meeting. For further information, please contact John Johnson, town planner, at 555-5000, extension 123. Mary. So you've given the person the courtesy of an answer, but you actually haven't discussed the application, and you haven't indicated a position one way or the other. And you also have alerted your staff to the fact that you've gotten an ex parte communication, and this can be shared with the rest of the people on the particular planning board, and they're aware that the communication came in. And that is pretty much where we wanted to stop the first portion of our conducting effective land use reviews workshops. And we wanted to transition. We're a little bit early on our schedule, but I think this will allow us to have a lot more question and answers for this portion. And I am going to give my screen sharing back to CJ from Grow Smart, and we can go into question and answers on this first part of this workshop.
All right, thanks, Nancy. So far we have 2 questions, and everybody who's here, please feel free to submit another question right now in the chat box. Or the Q&A box. Chat box is where people have been sending it so far. So we have our whole panel lined up here. Let me read you the first question. What about time limits for public comment, perhaps to prevent people from going on and dominating time?
I'll take a first crack. Some of the boards that I work for set out parameters depending upon what they see in the audience and participants before them. If there are not a lot of people who would like to speak, they don't limit people's time limits. If it's a packed house and say you're at your fire code capacity, the suggestion is you set a 3 to 5 minute limit. And the chair for that particular body would enforce that, and then invite them to return if they can't summarize their comment within that time period after everyone has had a chance to speak. I don't know if Amy or Andy, you've seen other practices?
Well, this is Andy. I think that it's a difficult balancing act. Legally, you can't give a developer 3 hours to put on a presentation with a real estate expert and an engineer and a biologist and a traffic expert, and then tell the neighbor you have 3 minutes only to talk about it. So legally, you can't do that. On the other hand, you do have a lot of problems with repetitive testimony and irrelevant testimony, particularly with neighbors. And so I think you have to walk the line. I think it's certainly good to try to set a time limit. I think, as you suggested, that's one way to do it, is say, look, let's have everybody go through once shortly, and then if people want to still talk, they can do it again later. I'll have to say, the best zoning board chair I ever saw was someone whose day job was as a third grade teacher. And she was great. She was there. Now you wait just a minute. You had your chance to talk. You sit down and wait till everybody else talks before you talk again. She was great. The other thing I would say as a practical thing about it is, I recommend that you don't allow questions to interrupt presentations. If you do have a developer that's putting on a series of witnesses, I don't recommend that the board allow questions as each one is talking, because that just ends up becoming a dialogue and everybody repeats the same speech in the guise of a question. What I recommend is let one side present their case. Your staff should be making note of what the questions are. The applicant should be making note of what the questions are. Then they can respond to the question. Then you can have people, they can respond to the questions as they go through them. So it's sort of, here's the presentation, here's the questions, here's the answers. To the extent that you can eliminate a back and forth dialogue between the objectors and the applicant, I think that will save time. The other thing is, where all possible, you had it very politely, don't answer rhetorical questions. But that's it. The board should not engage, for the most part, with the audience. They're asking questions. They should say, thank you, we'll forward that question to the applicant. Or, hey, Attorney Jones, did you write that question down so you can answer it later? But do it that way. Don't have board members get into individual answers with the applicants or objectors, because again, you're going to get into these dialogues in the middle of a hearing, which are just going to drag things out forever. So those are my tips.
Great. Thank you, guys. So we have a few more questions coming in. The next one is, I think, related to the current pandemic that we have, changes with that. And the question is, where are commissions posting the 2 other public postings, I think, other than the Secretary of State's website?
So this is Amy. The physical posting requirement was not suspended or changed in any way to account for remote meetings. And, that's questionable, right? What's the point of posting it at the town hall if town hall's by appointment only, the meeting's not going to be there? Staff should just be complying as best as they can, but that's the answer. The posting requirements for the physical notices are unchanged. So it needs to be physically posted at the place where the meeting would be held. Let's just say town hall, because that's wherever your meetings are typically held. And one other prominent place, a lot of times the library. Libraries are closed. So if there's a bulletin board outside, put it on the bulletin board. People who file Open Meetings Act complaints generally tend to be people who are aggrieved, who have an axe to grind. If your municipality is trying as best as it can, if staff is going above and beyond to post notice on its website, to communicate with residents, I would not anticipate any complaints about that. That, I think, is probably going to be the least of your worries.
This is Nancy. A few of the communities I've worked for, the second place the posting has wound up has been the police station, the lobby of the police station, because the police station is never closed.
This is Andy. The other thing too, I think, is if you're not already posting it on your website, that is essential. Post it on both the Secretary of State's website and your own website. And I don't know if we'll talk about it later or not, but obviously the other thing is with these virtual meetings, using your website to make sure that all the documents in the meeting are available. And by the way, when you post it on your town website, don't bury it 7 pages in. At least put a link to it right on the front page so that people can find it easily. Even if you don't put all the stuff there, put a link to it on the front page.
Great, thank you guys so much. So the next question is about the role of a zoning board alternate. And the question is, can zoning board alternates make motions or seconds as part of their active participation?
I'll take that. This is Amy. The answer to that is no. Zoning board alternates should listen, should ask questions, but the purpose of the alternate is to act in the absence of a regular member. So if there are less than 5 regular members who are available to act on an application, then the alternate acts in their place. And acting includes making motions and voting. The alternate should be engaged, should be listening, because perhaps throughout the whole discussion, one of the regular members forgot that they should have recused for some reason. Maybe their cousin lives next door to the subject property, and at the last minute, the regular member says, I just realized I need to recuse myself. Then the alternate steps in, but the alternate shouldn't be making motions unless they're acting in the place of a regular member.
Great, thanks, Amy. We have 2 more questions right now. The next one is, can you visit a site and ask questions if the applicant to gain information, can you visit a site and ask questions of the applicant to gain information on a pending application? And if not, how do you gather additional information without violating ex parte?
This is Amy again. We're going to talk about site visits in a little bit during the second portion of the morning presentation. What I would say to that is site visits, and this is previewing what we're going to discuss, should be publicly posted as open meetings. It's not considered an ex parte contact if other members of the board are there, if the discussion is made part of the record. And for those members either of the board or of the public who couldn't attend the site visit, at the next meeting, whether or not the official minutes from the site visit are available, you should generally discuss who was there, what was discussed, if anything. But keep in mind, site visits should mostly be to view the property. I don't think a site visit is an appropriate time to have an in-depth discussion. That should really be saved for a regular meeting when you think most people will be there. So a board member might take a look around, take a walk around the property, and then say to the applicant at the next meeting, I noticed this, can you explain it? But it would not be considered an ex parte contact if it's a notice site visit. If it's just an individual board member going to check out the property before the first meeting, you shouldn't be having a dialogue with the applicant. You should just indicate to the applicant who you are, why you're there.
Great, thank you, Amy. So the last question we have right now is, can boards have off-site retreats to talk about how the board is functioning and establish best board practices?
So this is Amy again, any meeting of the board has to be publicly noticed. So you can't have a meeting that's closed to the public. There is no exception that would apply to the Open Meetings Act to allow you to have an executive session on, internal board practices. You certainly can do a retreat like this, but it does have to be open to the public. Sometimes people might do, say, a retreat in the next town over. Think about whether or not you want to do that. You also can have the discussion, if you're the chair, for instance, you can have it as a discussion between just the chair and planning staff. So the basic answer is yes, but it needs to be a public meeting.
Great.
This is Andy. One of the things you can do also is you could have a public meeting like that, one of those workshops with a neighboring communities board or similar. We recently did a joint workshop of the historic district commissions from East Greenwich, Bristol, and Warren. And obviously we couldn't have it in all the town. We ended up having it in Bristol. Each one has to post it separately, but you can do that if you want. If you've got resources that can be shared or common questions, that's certainly something that can be done.
Excellent. Thanks to you both. So we have no more questions right now. I think we're a little bit ahead of schedule for our original agenda. Nancy, unless you would like to do something differently, my suggestion is that we take a break now, like we were planning to, but to come back maybe at 9:45 for part 2. Does that seem like a reasonable break length?
That sounds good. If the other speakers, Amy's going to be our next speaker. So when she's ready to go, we're all ready to go.
Yep, 9:45 is fine with me.
Okay, perfect. So for everyone listening and here, we're going to take a quick break so you can go, if you haven't made breakfast yet, go do that, whatever you need to do. We're going to kick back up at 9:45 for part 2 of conducting effective land use reviews. We're going to have Amy close this out with the presentation. We'll do another round of questions and answers just like this one, so we have another opportunity. A little bit of some housekeeping toward the end, and then that'll be a wrap on the first half of the day. So we'll see you back here at 9:45. And yeah, see you in a little bit. Okay, welcome back. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, okay. So we are going to start up part 2 of conducting effective land use reviews. We're going to have Amy kind of carry us through to the end. And after this part 2, we are going to have another Q&A session. So again, feel free to submit your questions whenever you have them, either in chat or the Q&A function. Both of those are private, by the way, so only I'll be able to see those and the panelists. And after we have that, we'll have a little bit of some housekeeping on sea level rise training, and then that'll be the end of part 1. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Amy. Take us away, Amy.
Yes, thanks. And I see that there was a question asked regarding the Open Meetings Act and
Amy, I can't hear you for some reason, but you're not muted.
I can hear her.
Unless, you know what, it's my computer. I apologize.
Okay.
It's my computer. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so there was a question asked during the break on the Open Meetings Act and subcommittees. I'm going to be happy to address that at the end of the presentation. So I'm Amy Goins of Ursulo, Tates and Rich. Our office represents several municipalities and other agencies. Been to a lot of zoning and planning meetings over the years, and lately have been to a lot of virtual meetings, and for the most part they're going well. So looking forward to sharing some tips with you specifically regarding virtual meetings. Let me bring up the presentation and we can begin. Okay, so this next part of the presentation is called the land use review process. The purpose of the land use review process is to maintain consistency between land use changes, the comp plan, and ordinances or regulations. The applicant submits information, witnesses, and materials to prove that the request satisfies the applicable standards for review, and the board, and with the cooperation of staff, evaluates that information received and entered into the record to determine whether the standards have been met. Standards are set forth in the municipality's ordinances and regulations, which may or may not be a mirror image of state law. And depending on the type of request, the review may be conducted by a public body or municipal staff. This is probably difficult for everyone to see, but the next slide is a flow chart that gives an overview of the land use review process. So it begins with, even before an application is submitted, the public body approving application forms, checklist, adopting rules of procedure. So those are setting the ground rules for how applications are processed. Application forms are distributed to the public, then an application is received, certified complete or incomplete by staff. Public meetings and hearings are scheduled, interested parties are notified. Other documents such as staff reports, advisory opinions related to the application are prepared. Then the packet containing the application, all the other documents sent to board members together with other documents prior to the meeting or hearing. Now you see those were all staff responsibilities. Now it shifts back over to the board. So the board reviews the application prior to the meeting, may or may not conduct a site visit, either as a group or individually to familiarize themselves with the subject property, public meeting or public hearing, deliberation, drafting a decision, and vote. And that may or may not, sometimes an application can be approved at a one and done meeting. Other times, as we know, it's over the course of many months in somewhat of a drawn out process. And then the last step of the process is decisions are, well, one of the last steps is decisions are recorded in the land evidence records, and the applicant has provided the decision and it's posted. And then of course we start the clock for a potential appeal. So the application packet is a packet of information prepared by staff and sent to the public body conducting the review, providing the necessary info to assess the application. All of the various bullet point items, packet contexts, this is what should be posted on the municipality's website for remote meetings. So remember that due process is notice and an opportunity to be heard. That should be refined a little further as a meaningful opportunity to be heard. So normally the public, members of the public sometimes come into town hall to review an application before the meeting. Many town halls I think are still either closed or open by appointment only. And in any event, we're trying to make it as easy as possible for people to review things before the meeting from the comfort of their own homes. Some public bodies were already providing this information digitally to board members, you know, electronic packets before the pandemic hit. I think that's the direction we should all be moving in. It's just, you know, anticipating record requests. As much as possible, staff should try to make submissions online, you know, electronic. Applicants should be asked to submit things in electronic form. That way it saves staff the responsibility or the necessity of having to scan everything. So, you know, all of these packet contents should be posted on the website, hyperlinked on the agenda if possible. They should at least be made available electronically. And that's certainly going to take some time, but I think it's something we should move toward. And the call out box on this slide indicates that some communities use a service such as Clerkbase for distributing meeting materials. So that's a good resource as well if your community has that. Preparing for a meeting. It's expected that board members at a minimum will have read the application. And if you don't understand something, you should contact staff before the meeting. Certainly you can feel free to ask questions during the meeting, but if there's something that's not making sense before the meeting, you should feel free to ask staff. And questions that one member asks before a meeting, ideally staff can report back on that so that if other members have the same questions, that can all be clarified. And in that way, you can have discussions with staff before a meeting that are aired in public at a meeting. So you should be asking yourself if you have enough information in the packet to demonstrate that one or more of the standards have been met. Now, certainly the packet's only part of it, right? The applicant will present testimony and other evidence if necessary at the hearing. You know, sometimes that's a large part of satisfying the standards as an expert to testify regarding a report, to answer questions, and then of course read any recommendations and staff reports. So at a minimum, we don't like to see board members showing up and clearly opening the seal on the packet for the first time on the evening of the meeting. But I don't think anyone on this call will be doing that. Site visits and inspections. A site inspection is a visit to the property to allow the public body to gather info by viewing the site and surrounding area. The public body may visit the site as a group or may make individual visits. Staff or a member of the public body could also present the body a video of that site. So I just want to note, you should have a discussion with staff and with your solicitor to consider whether group site visits are necessary now. I know some communities have had them recently. You know, with the gatherings limit still being at 15, I think through June, you know, and with social distancing measures in effect, I have some concerns, and perhaps they could be alleviated if I participated in one myself and saw that it you know, went okay. But I have some concerns about municipalities, you know, gathering people together in large groups. So I would encourage you to think of alternative ways for site visits. And I'm not referring to individual visits here. You know, kind of the due diligence visits that members do before a meeting to ensure that they, you know, they viewed the property. I'm talking about, you know, if during the course of a meeting, the public body thinks it would be good to get out to the site as a group and take a walk around and, you know, for example, view wetlands or view a property with specific, you know, historic conditions. I just want to make sure that you have that conversation with staff and with your solicitor. The other thing I want to mention is sometimes the question comes up, you know, are we allowed to go onto the property? And the general rule is that no, you know, by virtue of submitting an application, you're not giving carte blanche to board members to walk around anywhere, to have access, you know, at any time to any part of the property. But the application, I think, should include a statement or acknowledgement, you know, signed by the applicant that you understand and acknowledge that board members will be visiting the property and may access parts of the property before the meeting. And that way you're covered on that. And board members, you know, should just be respectful. If you can view the site from the road, do that. And if you need to contact staff, you know, if there's something you need to see, you can do a lot of the due diligence now with Google Earth and Google Maps. I've heard that some communities have staff do kind of a video walkthrough presentation. The other point I want to make is that there was a recent decision by the Attorney General in Rhode Island that a site visit must be open to the public in its entirety. So if, say, planning board members hop into a van to view, you know, the back area of a multi-acre property, the public has to be allowed to be on that van as well. There shouldn't be a site visit where only board members, you know, can be in one part of the property and the public is excluded. And I would encourage board members, again, for group site visits, I would suggest make it mostly about observation and try to limit discussions if possible. But generally,
Amy,
yes.
This is Nancy. I've lost my video, but I want to raise my hand. And in my volunteer position on the Richmond Planning Board, we've recently conducted, here we go, start my video. We've recently conducted some site walks on pre-applications. And under the pandemic rules, we made it very clear on the site walk agenda that social distancing was going to be required and masks were going to be required. The 2 site walks we conducted were integral to deciding the form of the application, whether it was going to be a conventional development or a conservation development. We did not have any extra public show up, but we did ensure everyone was wearing a mask, and we all were self-enforcing the social distancing rule. So that's how we've handled it so far. I think your tips on making sure the application forms have that statement about giving consent for the board members and staff to inspect the property for the purposes of making decisions is a great tip. And I just wanted to offer that. So if anyone has questions, they can contact the Richmond Planning Office as to how we conducted those site visits during this time period.
Thanks, Nancy. That's great to know that you've had a good experience with it. Sometimes we tend to, you know, think about worst case scenarios when giving advice, but that's good. I'm glad it went well.
Amy, this is Andy. If I could just say too, I've had a couple of experiences with it. One of which was a historic district commission, and it was a property that was going to be demolished. And it worked out well because it was a sunny day and we didn't really want more than one person at a time in the building anyway because of its condition. So people were spread out on the street around it, one at a time, walked in to look inside it. Another historic district commission, though, that usually always checks on window replacement, wants to see the actual condition of the windows from inside the house. And these are places where it's people's home they're still living in. That process has been stopped, and it's just been left with photographs and or architects' reports with photographs on the conditions of the existing windows. So 2 examples.
Okay, thanks, Andy. So continuing with site visits, the best practices would be to have the applicant's surveyor or engineer present to give overview of a site layout. Obviously, that's going to be a little different depending on whether we're talking about just a normal single-family zoning application or a large proposed development. Walk, observe, take notes, and ask questions. We recommend don't engage in debates or in-depth discussions. Again, just because it's difficult to capture that for the record, and particularly, you know, where you expect public participation to be, you know, to a smaller degree at a site visit than at a regular meeting. Take video and pictures of site features, mention at the hearing and include in the record. You know, just ensure that the record includes a summary of what was observed at the site visit. If you have a badge or some kind of identification that proves you're a member of the town board. And of course, examine aerial photos online beforehand. As I said, you can do a lot of prep on your own with Google Maps and Google Earth these days. Surveys ask for the property line or corners to be staked and have other notable features staked out. Again, that will depend on the nature of the application. All right, so getting into public hearings. A public hearing is a special portion of a public meeting held to take testimony about a land use request and to enter into the record all info that the board or commission will use in reaching its decision. So a public meeting is a meeting that is open to the public. A public hearing is a legal term, and the purpose of a public hearing is to have everything in the record be aired in public, but also, of course, the critical purpose of a public hearing is give the public an opportunity to speak. Rules of procedure should be used to govern the public hearing, to open, to close it, to continue it. The body must have enough detail to assess project impacts on the community and site sufficient to the standards of review in order to render a positive decision. So that's the goal of the applicant and the board, is getting to some kind of decision. And at this point, you've should have enough detail through the application process. Keep in mind there are special notice requirements required by state law for public hearings. That may be newspaper notice, that may be mail notice to the applicant. Some municipalities require a sign to be posted at the site. So the best practices for public hearings: begin the meeting with an explanation. What is the purpose of this public hearing? And make it clear that there are specific criteria that govern the board's procedure and guide its findings. This can all be provided on the municipality's website. It can be given as a oral overview by the planning or zoning chair at the beginning of a meeting. It can be included in staff comments. I like to see staff comments that include the required findings for subdivisions, land development projects. We don't see typically staff comments for zoning applications, but in any event, zoning board members usually have in front of them, if not the ordinance, maybe a template for a decision, so they can keep in mind the standards applicable to the application. So the ground rules, explain the rules of procedure, who will speak and when, indicate whether or not there will be time limits on testimony, acceptable and unacceptable behavior. I'm not sure that really needs to be, that will, I think, depend on the general, feel of your municipality. Do your debates devolve into, thinking the police are going to be called? Questioning of witnesses. Again, so as what Nancy and Andy said, ideally you want to minimize cross-examination by objectors. So have objectors indicate what questions they'd like to be answered. Those questions can be posed to the board, and then the board can, at the end of the objectors' presentations, summarize the areas that the applicant needs to provide more detail on. An ending time, set an ending time for the hearing. Some agendas indicate from rules of procedure, in accordance with the board's rules of procedure, our meetings typically last until 10 or 11 unless a motion is made to extend that time. But of course, when you have a meeting with a packed agenda, you should mention up front for everyone that we may not get to all these items tonight. So that way, people aren't surprised when it's 10 o'clock, you've only made it through 2 out of 8 items. So just set that expectation up front that not everything on the agenda may be heard and concluded that evening. And the chairperson is key to an effective hearing, and the 3 key responsibilities of a chair during a public meeting are maintaining order, maintaining the focus and direction of the hearing, and of course, facilitating the public hearing. Best practices for public hearings. So staff would summarize the application type, status and timeframes, listing all materials submitted, and indicating whether there are any outstanding items. Different municipalities have, sometimes staff will go first to kind of open the application. Other communities have the applicant go first. I think it depends on whether or not you have comments. It's, if you have written comments from staff that kind of set forth, here's what it is we're considering, here's a summary of the review so far, I think it's fine to have the applicant just jump right in and go ahead and present the application. So you'd have the applicant's presentation, expert testimony. You may have testimony from staff, advisory bodies, maybe written or in person. Then of course you have public testimony of opposition or support. In the closing portion of the public hearing, you need to give the applicant the opportunity to address any comments. Staff can summarize, indicate what the next steps are. The public body takes an action, whether that's voting to approve, deny, or continue. Now focusing on zoning boards. As we said earlier, verbatim records are required by state law. It doesn't necessarily need to be a stenographer, but it needs to be recorded at the very least. Most municipalities hire the stenographer and charge the cost to the applicant. Sometimes if the applicant hires a stenographer, your reg should require that the applicant must provide a copy of that transcript to the municipality. So you should ensure, and primarily it's the chair's responsibility, but staff can assist in this as well, ensure that every witness providing testimony speaks clearly and into a mic so that the public and the board are able to hear the testimony. Lately on Zoom, we've all gotten the reminders, try to identify yourselves each and every time you speak. And especially keep in mind that many people calling in for Zoom meetings may be calling in by telephone only. And it's a much different experience, you know, participating, just listening. So people should identify themselves with their name and address. And if they have any relevant credentials, you know, who they are. I'm the applicant's engineer. I'm a certified, I'm a registered professional engineer in the state of Rhode Island. Witnesses are required to take an oath before testifying before a zoning board. For planning boards, verbatim records are not strictly required. They should be recorded. And now I hope every municipality is aware of the recording function of Zoom. To me, there's no reason why all the Zoom meetings should not be posted. The recordings of the Zoom meetings should be posted on the municipality's website. I understand there may be an issue with size of recordings and server space. In any event, the recording should be kept by staff and made available to the public upon request. Oaths are optional for planning boards, but it's good practice to have everyone affirm that the testimony they're about to present is truthful. Best practices when taking expert testimony. Different boards have different practices on this. Sometimes boards will go through the process of recognizing speakers as experts. Other times it simply somewhat goes without saying. You know, the zoning and planning boards do not follow strict rules of evidence. You shouldn't be having hearings on whether people are experts. You should ask for copies of the resumes. If this is the first time you're seeing this professional, ask them to summarize their education and experience. So if there's a general consensus, this person should be accepted. You know, we don't usually, you know, an engineer, a traffic expert, a wetlands biologist, those are the typical categories of experts that we see. All witnesses are subject to questions, and it's recommended that all questions go through the chair. I want to take a minute to speak about the significance of expert testimony, and this could really be a whole presentation on its own. I just want to give a kind of a high-level overview. I'll quote from a 1998 Rhode Island Supreme Court decision, Restivo versus Lynch. The court said in that case, there is no talismanic significance to expert testimony. It may be accepted or rejected by the trier of fact. In that case, the zoning board or the planning board. So simply because someone puts themselves forward as an expert doesn't mean you have to take their testimony as gospel. However, all expert testimony is not the same. In that case, the Rhode Island Supreme Court cited an earlier case which held that lay testimony on traffic data is not competent and has no probative force. And that's still good law today. Really, you need an expert to explain things that the general public, lay people, can't understand. So we can all see traffic, but there is apparently a science to testifying as a traffic expert. You know, I've seen people do their own traffic studies. the court would not look well on that. But for instance, drainage, you know, if somebody says, if an expert says we flagged the wetlands, there's wetlands only in one portion of the site. A neighbor says, well, I've lived there for 30 years and I see this other portion of the site is currently a pond. That's something that, that's testimony that that layperson is competent to give. Is there a pond there or not? You know, do you have water in your basement every spring? So describing physical facts and conditions is something that anyone can do, whether or not they're an expert. What you should do if there are discrepancies between expert testimony and objector or board testimony is ask the expert if they can explain those discrepancies. So in making a decision, a board can reject expert testimony, but it's critical that they give their reasons why. So this slide says you don't have to believe an expert's opinion. You don't have to accept an expert's opinion that wetland impact is not significant or traffic congestion won't be at acceptable levels. However, it's truly critical that the board sets forth the reasons why it has rejected that expert opinion, and certainly consult with your solicitor to make these decisions on a case-by-case basis, because that's one area where boards can get into trouble in the area of expert testimony. Best practices regarding exhibits. Keep in mind here, one of the goals of the board should be ensuring that a reviewing body or reviewing court understands the decision you made and why you made it. So exhibits are part of that. The record needs to be clear, whether it's a zoning board reviewing a decision of a planning board or the court reviewing a decision of one of those bodies. The court needs to be able to understand what were the exhibits, because they will all go to the reviewing authority. So an exhibit is a document, record, or other tangible object formally introduced as evidence as part of a hearing. Sometimes we see members of the public come up to the board, you know, in a physical meeting setting, come up to the board and display a cell phone. Well, if that picture hasn't been provided to staff, then it can't really be considered part of the record. So anyone who wants the board to consider something should be advised to submit copies. Now, it's okay for someone to, you know, if let's say they only have one copy and they're reading from something, staff should advise them, submit a copy the next day so that it can be included in the record. Each exhibit should be labeled by number or letter and must be entered into the record. You should keep, try to separate applicants' exhibits from objectors' exhibits. When referring to exhibits during a hearing, be sure that they're identified correctly and clearly describe what aspect of the exhibit is being discussed. So with regard to Zoom meetings, keep in mind, again, people participating just by telephone, it's easy to see if staff is screen sharing a site plan, but you should attempt to have board members, you know, indicate what's being discussed. You know, I see on your site plan that there's an existing deck here. Is that deck being removed or is that deck being kept? So indicate, are we talking about the north side of the property, the south side? Just so people on the phone can orient themselves. Visual materials used should either be large enough so that everyone in the room is able to clearly see them, or several copies of the material need to be placed throughout the room or projected on a screen in some way. So it's easier with Zoom. Take pictures of the exhibits for the record, and if an exhibit is changed, mark with red pen what the changes were and have the applicant sign and date it for the record. And that's important. We've seen sometimes, you know, with zoning boards, for example, if there was a portion of the property or the proposed development that needed relief that wasn't properly advertised, the applicant may wish to go forward with the rest of the application, and may say, you know, I'll withdraw that request for relief on the deck. So I'd still like setback relief for the left side addition, but I no longer need the rear setback relief for the deck. Have them cross that out in red and initial it, so it's clear, you know, to the next building official who's looking at it several years down the line, that the deck is no longer part of the relief requested. Best practices for continuing and/or closing a hearing. You should determine if all interested parties who want to testify have been heard and determine whether there's sufficient information on the record to address all standards for review. Of course, we need to keep in mind when we're talking about planning boards, we are constrained in a large way by the deadlines that are applicable to state action. So there's only so much that we can do without the consent of the applicant to keep a meeting going. Certainly, if you have the applicant's consent, those deadlines can be waived. Keep in mind the consent should be written. But once you're ready for action, if there are still people who need to weigh in, or if the applicant still needs to provide additional testimony, the hearing should be continued. So make sure there's enough time during the decision-making period. And it's good practice to let the board know at the outset of the hearing what the deadline for decision is and how many meetings remain between the current meeting's date and the deadline for decision. So the board may act differently if they know that there are 3 regular meetings between tonight's date and the deadline for decision versus if there's only 1 regular meeting. So a hearing may be continued if all testimony can't be heard in the time allocated, if the public body doesn't have sufficient information, or certainly if the applicant requests a continuance. So the chair will entertain a motion to continue the hearing to a specific date, time, and place. It's important to mention that public hearings, which are legally required to be advertised, must be continued to a specific date and time. So it can't be continued indefinitely. Otherwise, it would have to be re-advertised. It should be continued to a specific date, time, and place. And there may be uncertainties, you know, as to whether the applicant will be ready to proceed on the new date. That's fine. You can just continue it to the next meeting date, and if necessary, continue it further past that date, but it can't be left open. It does need to be continued to a date certain. So you should vote on the motion for a continuance, and additional notice would be required only if the date, time, and place were not announced. The best practice for continuing meetings or continuing public hearings that we know are going to be continued off an agenda that's been posted is to do it at the outset of the meeting. You know, if a meeting has 10 items and we know that item number 8 will be continued to the next meeting per the applicant's request, do that at the outset of the meeting so that you don't have people waiting either in the room or waiting in the Zoom room, you know, till 10 o'clock, but also mention it when you reach that point in the agenda. Mention, you know, for those of you who came in late, we previously continued this agenda item to such and such date and time. Or you may be ready to close the hearing, and a hearing can be closed when the public body has received sufficient information. So that should be done via motion to close the public hearing. A public hearing can be reopened after it's closed. It's not that closing a public hearing is a you know, decision you can't come back from. You may need to reopen the public hearing if somebody walks into the room late, or if the applicant, you know, let's say they didn't think an expert would be able to attend, and now the expert shows up 2 minutes after the public hearing is closed. It should be reopened via motion. Sometimes we need to reopen a public hearing for a specific limited purpose, you know, to provide an opportunity for public comment solely on one expert report or one expert, one discrete aspect. So that can be announced by the chair that the public hearing is opened solely for a specific purpose. That way you're not inviting everyone to kind of come up and repeat what they've already said. Okay, now getting into standards for review. The standards for review are the written criteria and requirements that a land use request must meet in order to be approved. And so all your decisions need to be based on the applicable standards. The standards must be formally adopted and are either part of an ordinance or regulation. Standards for review promote fairness by ensuring that requests will be evaluated on the same basis, ensuring that the applicant and the public knows what standards must be met, so establishing the burden of proof for the application, and ensuring that a land use request will be approved only if it promotes the common good of the whole community. And these standards are mandated by state law and also by municipal ordinances and regulations. Going to zoning boards, these standards are mandated by state law. Your zoning ordinance should have a verbatim language to this effect. I will mention specifically with regard to dimensional variances. You may have heard that in 2002, the Zoning Enabling Act was amended to eliminate one of the standards for a dimensional variance, specifically that no reasonable alternative exists. That is still in some zoning ordinances, but it is considered superseded by that amendment to state law. So just, you know, that's always on our rainy day list, making amendments to our ordinance that will, you know, bring it in line with state law. If you are from a municipality that has outdated language in the zoning ordinance, you may find members of the public citing it. As solicitor, I always try to remind, even though the board is familiar with that specific change, I always try to remind the board whenever it comes up, because I want to be sure we all know what the standards are. So just quickly, the standards for a dimensional variance, and remember, they all must be met. If one of them is not met, then the request must fail. The hardship, which is the reason for requesting the variance, is due to the unique characteristics of the property or structure and not to the general characteristics of the surrounding area, and also is not due to physical or economic disability of the applicant, excepting certain physical disabilities addressed elsewhere, you know, ADA accommodations. The hardship is not the result of the applicant's prior action and does not result primarily from a desire for greater financial gain. The granting of the variance will not alter the general character of the surrounding area or impair the intent or purpose of the zoning ordinance or comp plan. The relief to be granted is the least relief necessary, and denying the hardship would amount to more than a mere inconvenience. The board can attach special conditions to a variance. So I'd probably amend this slide in the future because it's not specifically a standard of review. It's just something that the board can keep in mind. You can impose reasonable conditions on a zoning approval. Special use permit, the enabling legislation provides for the municipalities to set standards. You may find that your zoning ordinance has a set of general criteria for special use permits. It may have specific criteria for certain types of special use permits. You need to read your ordinance and consult with your solicitor to determine whether a certain request must satisfy both the specific and general standards, or whether only the specific standards need to be satisfied. And a use variance to be used in rare circumstances. The standards are mostly the same as a dimensional variance, except that the more than a mere inconvenience standard is replaced with the standard that's much higher to meet, which is that the subject property can't yield any beneficial use if it were required to conform to the provisions of the zoning ordinance. And again, the board can attach special conditions to any approvals. Turning to planning boards, state law sets forth required findings for approval. I won't read these all, but I'll just mention, I've seen in at least one municipality additional findings that are required. Keep in mind where state law sets forth a list, an exclusive list, you know, here are the required findings. Municipalities can't impose findings above and beyond what state law sets forth. Those will be deemed ultra vires or beyond the authority of the board to impose. So one of those specifically that was addressed in a Superior Court decision a few years ago was a special requirement imposed by the municipality that a subdivision or land development project provide for the preservation of historic or cultural features, which sounds great. However, the Superior Court struck that down, said it was not authorized by state law. There are additional findings that are required by state law for certain other things that the planning board has within its purview. And again, all this will be set forth in your subdivision and land development regulations. Turning now to deliberations and decisions. So deliberation consists of participatory discussion during which the public body determines its decision by evaluating whether or not the requests meet the standards. You should encourage all ideas and views, encourage differences of opinion. Everyone should participate, including alternates. Keep in mind, it's my advice, whether we're talking about zoning or planning members, alternates should be participating actively, asking questions, but should not be making motions unless they're acting in the place of a regular member. And it's the chair's responsibility to make sure everyone has the opportunity to be heard. Keep in mind, as we're talking about deliberations, that the most important thing you need to do is articulate why you're making the decision you're making. So the decision should be easily understandable by a reviewing board or a reviewing court. The most important part of the decision is the word because and the content that follows that. So not simply setting forth what the standards are and, you know, a conclusory statement that the application satisfies these standards. You know, depending on what we're talking about, a small single family request for zoning relief versus a major proposed subdivision or a comprehensive permit, land development, you're going to want to have staff and board members, if they're willing and able to participate in this way, to identify specific portions of the comprehensive plan or purposes of the zoning ordinance that the application comports with. So as the board deliberates whether or not the standards for review have been met, they should actively note the following for each standard: findings of fact with specific reference to evidence in the record; conclusions of law, statements of how a fact proves that a legal criterion has been met or has not been met; conditions of approval, and any special conditions. The best practice tip is list any special conditions on the recorded plan as well as in the recorded decision to ensure that future property owners are aware of the conditions and to ensure compliance with the conditions, right? Because if a condition either isn't known or enforced, it might as well not be there. Best practice tips for drafting the decision. The decision should include a summary of what the request is. That should be verbatim from the agenda. The standards that must be met. If the board voted to approve the application, list the evidence that convinced the board each standard had been met. And it's very important in the case of a denial, you do need to set forth the reasons for denial. Simply saying that it doesn't satisfy the standards isn't enough. There needs to be some explanation of why the board denied the application. You'll typically get that when a motion is made for denial. The member making the motion will articulate why they're moving for denial. Sometimes you have to be extra careful in the case of a motion for approval that fails. You'll need to make sure the members who voted against the motion to approve set forth the reasons for their vote. We recommend that the board votes on the decision and that the decision be drafted by staff working with legal counsel before the board finally votes. So ideally, the board would have a draft decision ready for it. Now, if it's the first meeting and staff isn't sure which way the board wants to go, if there are some questions, if there's a number of outstanding items, you may not have a draft decision for the first meeting. But certainly after 2 or 3 meetings, the staff should have some sense of where it's going. I've seen boards presented with twin motions to approve and deny. I recommend against that. That just, you're setting forth the argument for the applicant on appeal, no matter what happens. So once a final draft has been completed, it should be sent to the board members and the applicant's legal counsel prior to the meeting at which it will be voted. I think sending it to the applicant's legal counsel is a matter of courtesy. You're not, I don't think it's assumed that they have any input in the draft decision per se, but it is a matter of courtesy. And voting. So if findings of fact demonstrate that all the standards have been met, there should be a motion to approve the request, and denial should be a motion to deny if one or more of the standards hasn't been met. So the chair should call for a motion, state the action to be taken. There should be a second, discussion on the motion, and this discussion portion of the motion is where you're going to want members to reiterate what they discussed during the rest of the meeting. Then vote. All votes on Zoom meetings should be by roll call. So either the chair or the secretary can list the members present and record their vote. And then the chairperson can state the outcome of the vote. It was approved unanimously, it was approved 5-1, whatever it is. The board does not have to read the entire draft decision prepared by staff into the record, but you need to reference what you're using to vote on, such as draft decision dated, June 1st, 2020, prepared by staff, and then read the agenda item. If there's a number of findings of fact or conditions of approval, you don't need to read them verbatim, but you could reference conditions of approval 1 through 10. And ideally, the draft decision, if it's available to the board before the meeting, it should be available to the public before the meeting. Again, staff comments, we'd like to see municipalities now in the era of remote meetings move toward posting as much as possible online prior to the meeting. Now getting into a little bit of ethics, and I just need to say this also could be its own half-day training topic. So this is just a very basic overview of the difference between recusing and conflicts, and they're related, of course. Recusal means that a public official declines to participate in a matter because of a potential conflict of interest. In some circumstances, recusal is required. If I'm on a board and if the subject property is next door to my primary residence, I'm required to recuse because that's a clear conflict of interest under the Code of Ethics. If I'm on a board and the applicant before me is a friend, is a member of my night basketball league, I may choose to recuse simply to avoid an appearance of impropriety, not because recusal would strictly be required. The main message I want to impart to everyone is rely on your solicitor with ethical questions. We appreciate it when you can bring the questions to our attention before the meeting. although certainly better late than never. We certainly want to have the questions addressed before the vote. A conflict of interest may exist if an official can reasonably expect that his or her official conduct will directly result in a financial benefit or even a negative financial impact to himself or herself, family, business associates, employers, or businesses that the official represents. The conflict need not be certain to occur, but the probability must be greater than conceivably. I'm going to refer you to the website for the Rhode Island Ethics Commission, and I'm going to show you how to navigate there. So if everyone can still see my screen, I think I'm on the home page for the Rhode Island Ethics Commission, which is ethics.ri.gov. On the left-hand side of the menu, there's a link to, yes.
Amy, you're not. You're still on the PowerPoint.
Okay, thank you.
Screen.
All right. So let me then just describe how to navigate there. There's a link on the left-hand side to education and publications. And then you'll have to jump over to the right-hand side, click on Guide to the Code. I'd refer you all to that section of their website. It's kind of a plain language overview of the important provisions of the Code of Ethics. So maybe make that your first stop, and certainly consult with your solicitor, because many of these questions require some thought. They're not all black and white answers. Okay, so you're required by state law, if you have a potential conflict of interest, you must recuse from participation, you must file a recusal form. And that form is available on the Ethics Commission's website. If there is a matter that doesn't actually rise to the level of a conflict of interest, but in which an appearance of impropriety might be perceived, you should still provide notice of the perceived conflict along with an explanation as to the reasons why you believe that you're able to participate objectively, fairly, and in the public interest. And that is also, you'd set that forth on the recusal form as well. So the recusal form has two boxes to be checked, and one is if you're recusing, one is if you're not recusing. So you explain the situation either way. Board members should keep in mind they're not allowed to represent themselves before the public body unless the Ethics Commission has specifically granted a hardship exception to the Code of Ethics. That also applies to having an attorney or family member or anyone else represent you. You still need a specific permission from the Ethics Commission, and you can't represent another person before your public body as well without that specific permission.
Amy.
Yes.
Nancy, and I just have a best practice tip that kind of helps the board and commissioners out, is if the staff or the clerk of their board or commission could just have copies of those forms available at the meeting. Sometimes you don't realize a conflict until you're actually at the meeting. And that way you can fill out the form and step away from the board if necessary. And another good practice is that the form is required to go to the Secretary of State. Is that correct? Did I hear that correct? That the staff,
the Ethics Commission.
Ethics Commission, sorry. That the staff copy the form and send it in for the board members, just to make sure nobody forgets.
Yes, thank you. That's good advice. And if the form isn't available that night, it should be filled out and submitted as soon as possible after the meeting. Keep in mind, recusing isn't the same thing as abstaining. If you're recusing, you don't participate at all. And with regard to Zoom meetings, if you're recused from a matter, you should mute yourself and stop your video for the duration of the application. In a physical meeting setting, the advice would be to leave your seat up on the podium or the dais and sit in the audience with the public. Some municipalities even have a policy that you should physically leave the room. You know, when you're doing a Zoom meeting, I think you're stopping your video is sufficient. You know, you're not participating. Abstaining is just abstaining from the vote. So you may be participating in discussions on something, but you're declining to vote. Zoning board members are not allowed to abstain. And that comes from the requirement in state law that 5 members of the zoning board are required to hear an application. Quorum issues can be raised by recusal and or abstention. You may not have enough members to hear a matter. And in limited circumstances, the Ethics Commission can grant a hardship exception to the board and to 1 or more members based on the rule of necessity. So in essence, you'd have the solicitor setting forth the nature of the conflicts. I think that this recently came up in New Shoreham. You know, it's not uncommon in small towns where so many people are related, you know, if not by friendship or business association. But it's important to note the public body must seek an advisory opinion from the Ethics Commission before acting on the matter. Now, keep in mind, the deadlines are still running. So the advice for board members and staff is please air your potential conflicts and questions as soon as possible. And I think I may be at the end of the formal presentation.
Yes, indeed. Thanks so much, Amy. That was fantastic. So we do have some questions ready. Let me pull those up. All right, so our first question is, can you create a subcommittee to work on a topic and report back to the board without needing to make the subcommittee public?
Okay, great question, and I'd love to take this one. So it's very important to remember under the Open Meetings Act, if board members could do all their work as subcommittees that weren't subject to the Open Meetings Act, that's what everyone would be doing. We don't want to use subcommittees to circumvent the spirit of the Open Meetings Act, which is that public business should be performed in public, open to the public. Also, there's a question of boards creating multiple subcommittees. Sometimes you may find that, you know, boards may not be authorized to form their own subcommittees. There's a question of staff time and resources, as you know, all. So I would really suggest there should really never be a reason to have a subcommittee for a zoning board. Planning boards may need subcommittees for specific purposes, such as when we're talking about reviewing and updating the comprehensive plan. But my suggestion would be, rather than subcommittees, schedule specific work sessions. And maybe it's understood that not everyone on the board will be participating. But, you know, if the general question is, can you create a subcommittee to work on a topic and report back without needing to make the subcommittee public? The answer is no, I don't endorse that. Even if it's just a subcommittee of 2 members, the board's work should be done in public.
I'd like to address that, CJ, as well. I totally agree with Amy that you're a public body and your work should be done in front of the public. But she mentioned like having a subcommittee to do the comprehensive plan. In communities I've worked with, we've created citizen advisory groups as a subcommittee of the planning board to work on the comp plan, because the planning board is charged by state law to create and author that comp plan. Another example of a subcommittee for a planning board is to create a technical review committee. And they function as advisory to the main board, but they always operate in an open format with posted agendas. So those are some examples on subcommittees.
Great, thank you both. So we have a question here about confidentiality, which is what materials submitted can be kept confidential, and what is that process to guarantee these materials remain confidential?
So this is Amy. That's really a question of the Access to Public Records Act. You know, I'd say I'd be hesitant to think that almost anything in a planning application or zoning application would be considered confidential. But that's really a question of, should it be considered confidential under the Access to Public Records Act? Yeah, Andy, you want to jump in on this? I see.
Yeah, well, we have one, you remember, we did have one example of this, which was the application for a fitness center. And part of their arguments about parking was when their peak demands were for parking, but it was based on proprietary information about their business, how many customers they got at particular times. So we submitted it to the board as a confidential exhibit. I don't think we had any pushback on that particular, we had other pushback, but not on that confidential exhibit basis. And for the board, it was simply a matter of keeping it separate in a separate manila envelope that said confidential. And the exception on the Open Records Act is that it's proprietary business information. Now, it's always up to the zoning board. The zoning board could say, you know, we can't really deliberate and discuss this in public unless we talk about it. So applicant, you've either got to just give us the right to make it public or have someone say what you want public and nothing else, or we're not going to consider it. But that's about the only time in the last 30 years or so that I can remember it being done. So it's very rare. And as I said, I think a board could reject it if they wanted to.
Agree.
Great,
I would
thank
just
you.
add, though,
Oh,
that
sorry.
there are some communications between board members and solicitors on pending litigation. There are things that are confidential.
Okay.
It's not in the application.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can have attorney-client privilege information, which can be confidential, but it's going to be seeking attorney-client legal advice. It can't just be like, how should we vote? You can't use that as a way to get around a private discussion, but that would be another way that would be something that would be confidential. Usually probably in more the conflict or recusal category that we were talking about.
Great, thank you guys. So another question kind of about confidentiality and privacy. What private conversations about an application can a planning board member have with executive staff or a fellow board member? Any limitations here?
Sure, I'll take that first since I'm already unmuted. Because the answer is really easy with the fellow board member. None, nothing, nada, zip, the big bubble. Board members shouldn't be talking to each other about the substance of an application or a potential application in any way outside of a public meeting. So the opposite is true with the staff. The board members can talk to the staff, and that's how they should. If they have issues or concerns, they should go to the staff. As we said, if they get some ex parte contact from a neighbor, they should be handing that over to the staff, exposing it to the light of day. It's okay for them to meet with the staff and talk about issues. The staff obviously shouldn't be telling them how to vote, but can often provide more information, or now the staff knows that they have to get more information to answer those questions.
Great, thanks, Andy. Couple questions in a row about site visits here. So the first one is, I guess it's a two-part question. Can staff do property site visits? What if there is special training required to visit the site? Do we need to coordinate with the property owner to get to the site for inspections?
So this is Amy. Remember that when what we've said about site visits and the commentary on the Open Meetings Act, that applies to the board members. So staff aren't subject to the Open Meetings Act. Staff can feel free to do whatever, you know, of course, discussing with the applicant. So staff can certainly conduct site visits. I'm not sure I think I'd need more context on special training required to visit the site. I mean, yes, you should coordinate with the property owner.
Great, thanks, Amy.
I'll pick up.
Go ahead, Andy.
This is Andy. I'll just pick up on the special, I don't know about special training, but special conditions. Like you might have to have people wear hard hats if they're going through a shipyard or something on a tour while it's open. We also have had things where applicants have wanted indemnification to say that, you know, they would be indemnified if someone got hurt. And so as town solicitors, we have done that from time to time and said, you know, no, yes, that's fine. If one of our historic district commissioners is injured while walking through your building that's falling apart, we're not going to sue you. And then it's your responsibility to make sure safety. I think I mentioned the one that we just had a couple of weeks ago, concerned about the floors and whatnot, and said, okay, only one person at a time in the building. And the people who went in, actually, the members of the commission tended to be architects, who were the ones who wanted to go inside. The non-architects among us, myself included, decided, no, I'll just look at it from the windows and the open doorway.
Thanks, Andy.
This is Nancy. I got one point is something that could possibly be cited on agendas if you're doing a site walk on raw undeveloped property, to note that the site walk may involve a lot of physical activity. Walking could have hazardous conditions such as trees downed, could be wet, could be muddy, and also suggest that perhaps anyone who comes to the site walk would be responsible for their own sort of protection items, like if they need boots or insect, bug repellent, all those type of things individuals should be prepared to provide for themselves.
Great, and we have a follow-up from the attendee who submitted that question in the chat, which is special training. An example would be hazardous commercial sites. Visiting Block Island Wind Farm has international safety requirements if we need to check on things there. So actually another question on site visits, very relevant to what we were just talking about. For site visits, must transportation to the site be provided by the city for board members and or the public?
The answer to that is no.
Great, that's an easy one. Next question, recusal forms. Where do they need to be submitted to after a meeting? Secretary of State?
That goes to the Ethics Commission.
Great.
And make sure you keep a copy of the recusal form in the file of the particular application.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I'm just toggling these questions here. All right, next question is the sale or donation of land considered land use? For example, is a municipal land trust board required to follow the same guidelines as a planning board in a public hearing on the potential sale or transfer of land to the land trust?
Let me take that one, since I've got a lot of experience with land trusts on both sides. First of all, there's a specific exemption for the open meeting for the acquisition or disposition of property where the public information would be detrimental. Obviously, if you're considering buying a piece of property and it becomes public, the price of that property could go up. So there's a specific exemption if you do that, and I don't think we're going to take the time now, but there's a whole procedure under open meetings to go into executive sessions, cite the exemption, et cetera, report back afterwards. But that could be done. The second question is, I have found out that, interestingly enough, About half the land trusts in Rhode Island are part of the municipality. They're basically a subdivision of the municipality in that they use the municipality's tax ID number. And they have members appointed by the town council and so forth. And those bodies are definitely included in the Open Meetings Act requirements for, so all other elements and how they go into executive session would still apply. The other half of the land trusts in Rhode Island are generally private 501c3 organizations and are probably not bound by the Open Meetings Act unless they're getting significant funding. If they're getting $50,000 a year or more from the municipality, then that would be another way that would flip them into being a public body. But there could be some land trusts out there that are totally private, despite having, you know, your city name here, land trust. If they're totally private, raise their money privately, not more than $50,000 from the municipality, that wouldn't be subject to the Open Meetings Act. They'd be like any other private charity.
Great, thank you, Andy. Next question is about advisory boards. If you have advisory boards, how can staff communicate with these boards? Are all communications public record? And what are the rules for meeting with these boards?
Sure, I'll take that one. You know, the purpose of the advisory boards is to guide the decisions of the decision-making boards. So generally, we don't see the entire record that the advisory board reviews transmitted to the planning board, for example. We would just see the decision letter, and staff would be available to answer questions. So the question is, how can staff communicate with the advisory boards? The staff should be can communicate them with in the same way that planning and zoning staff communicate with their members. We want to have our communications public record. Yes, all those communications would be subject to the Access to Public Records Act, unless they're, you know, communications with an attorney that are privileged in some way, communications about, do I need to recuse from this? Rules for meeting with these boards. I'm not sure if the question is, could a planning board member discuss a matter with an advisory board, you know, or a member of an advisory board on their own time outside of a meeting? But the general principle is that you want to have the advisory board's decisions memorialized for the record. Someone, if necessary, whether you have a liaison or just a staff person available to the decision-making board to explain why the advisory recommendation came out the way it did. I'm not sure I can give more specific guidance on that. Maybe Nancy can chime in.
Sorry, this is Nancy, had to unmute, juggling the buttons here. I would just default back to Andy's answer. And if they're public, members of a public body, and even an advisory board is a public body, they shouldn't be discussing things outside of meetings. That would be my cut on it. And if Andy feels differently, he can advise us, but I'm always one to caution, you know, to advise and be cautious about outside conversations and activities to avoid those ex parte communications.
This is Andy. I'll comment, and I guess we do have a little time, so I'll just talk about specific things. I mean, we have a problem. We live in a small state, and a lot of us live in small towns in that small state. So on a practical level, it's hard because you're running into these people. You go into the supermarket, you go into the bagel shop, you go into the corner store, and you see these people and you want to talk to them. These are your fellow board members. You've come to know them. And this is where I think we talk about appearance being very important. You know, you walk into the bagel shop and one of the other members of your board is there. Your inclination might be to get your coffee and bagel and go over and sit down next to him or her. And then lo and behold, the third one comes in. Now, if the third one comes in and sits down, then if it's a 5-member board, you've got a quorum, and right away someone could be filing a complaint against you. But even the 2 of you together there, the problem is with the public. They don't know what you're talking about. They don't know that you're talking about, thank God sports are starting up again and we'll have something else to watch on TV. Or can we really believe that Brady is gone? They don't know that. They just as well think you're talking about next Tuesday night's application before the board. So avoid that appearance. If you've got that, come in, say hello, how are you? Looking forward to seeing you. But keep it short. Keep it to less than a minute, and then go sit at your own table rather than together. Same thing. Years ago, there was a complaint. There was an actual complaint because of the Bristol Town Council. There was a big holiday party that someone had. And all 5 members of the council happened to be at that same holiday party. So there was a complaint that they had violated the law by having this quorum of the council present at the party. Now, the good news is it was found not to be it. There was no discussion of any meeting, of any official business, so it wasn't a violation. But it still was a hassle for everybody to deal with. So again, just watch it. If you're there in that situation and you're at a party, fine, say hello to your fellow council members, but then wander off. Don't have a quorum or a couple, or worse yet, all 5 of the council members getting together to chat in the sun porch together. Avoid that appearance of it, because people walking by or at a distance just have no idea whether you're talking about sports or the business before you. And then if you get a complaint, it's a hassle. You're going to have your lawyer. You're all going to have to sign affidavits of what you were talking about, and it's just not worth it. So watch for that appearance. That's all I have to say. But no, I mean, that's not well. I'm stopping simply because I feel like we should be on walkie-talkies here, and I'd say over when I'm done. So I'm done with this, but I'm happy to answer further questions.
Thanks, Andy. And I see the person who submitted the question on advisory boards has clarified. The question is really, if I want to help get the advisory board up to speed on applications and not waste time, can I meet with the entire board in private to save them time, or is that public? Private meetings are not allowed, right? We're still under the Open Meetings Act. So if you want to do it, the only advice I can give, or probably the best advice I can give, is if you want to do a meeting at which you are trying to avoid members of the public come in, you are not prohibited from scheduling meetings outside of your regularly posted meeting schedule, right? So let's say we're talking about a conservation commission and you've posted your annual meeting schedule. We're going to meet once on the 3rd Thursday of the month at 7 o'clock. There is nothing preventing you from adding additional special meetings, provided that they've been posted in accordance with the OMA, right? 48 hours excluding weekends and holidays. So you can email the board. We're going to have a special session to get everyone up to date on our applications and prepare for, prepare for the actual meeting. This is just going to be for discussion only, not for any action. You absolutely need to let the applicants know. You shouldn't be having meetings at which specific applications are discussed where the applicant doesn't know about them. That would not be kosher. But if the intent is, not wasting time for the public or just wanting to keep the discussions in private to the extent you can schedule a special work session. But when you have a meeting of a public body, it needs to be a public meeting posted publicly.
I would just add, as staff, you also, if this is a staff person of some sort, you prepare memos about your applications with all of the summary materials. That is public, but that is the way it's generally done, is that you summarize the applications and the pertinent issues, and you give that to your board members, with about a week advance for them to read, and it is part of the public record.
Great, thanks all. So I think this will be the last question we have for right now. Oh, you know what? We have a follow-up to that point. Amy, if you want to read that, it seems like you have easy access to the chat.
So the follow-up is, can we schedule discussions between a developer and an advisory board prior to an application? Yes, you can, but it just needs to be publicly posted.
Great. So our last question for right now, I think, is can reason for recusal be discussed at a public meeting?
Yes, if you're the board member recusing and you want to explain why you're recusing, you certainly can. It's not, you know, it's not considered private information. Those recusal forms are all public. So yes, you certainly can do that.
This is Nancy. I'd also like to chime in on that, and I'd like to say it's not required, but I think you should state your reasons for recusal because it helps build your credibility, and it helps not only the other board members, but your staff and the people who may be in your audience understand why you are recusing. Shouldn't be a state secret, and it's going to be on file publicly with the Ethics Commission anyway. Over.
Great point, Nancy. Thank you. So those are all our questions for right now. We will have more opportunities for Q&A during our afternoon workshop, which is Making Sound Decisions. We'll have, again, 2 opportunities. So everyone who's here, I really hope you'll come back for that one as well. That's going to kick off at 1 p.m. With the same exact Zoom link. So you can either leave this webinar open or you can, close it and come back again at 1 p.m. Shortly I'll be sending out the PDF of this presentation to you. And then hopefully before too long, I'll be able to send you this recording as well. So thanks for joining us for this morning, and we hope to see you at 1 p.m.
CJ?
Yeah.
One thing, we wanted to run through some of the resources for mandatory training.
That's right. Thanks, Nancy.
And you were going to share screen with me so I could show them a site where they could find those resources.
I think you should be able to go ahead and share your screen if you have it up.
Let's see. Share screen. All right. Getting there. Hold on one sec. Can you see my screen?
Yep, looks good.
All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring folks to the Rhode Island Division of Statewide Planning webpage. It's our homepage, which is basically www.planning.ri.gov. And when you're on this page, go to the area of planning areas on this little tab right here. Scroll down, click on land use and natural resources. And on the right side, we've got some really quick links. Go to the land use law page. This page is a reference for many of the things we talked about this morning, all of the Rhode Island land use enabling laws and other laws related to planning, summaries of our legislative work for the past several years. Down in the middle page here is an explanation of the mandatory education that was required specifically for planning boards and commissions. And this was approved in 2017 by the Rhode Island General Assembly. It requires that planning board members educate themselves on sea level rise, climate change, and flooding issues. And there's also a requirement that the planning board self-certify, which means they file their own certificate to their town clerk that they've done the training. And on our webpage for the Division of Planning, we have a sample certificate. Anything you see on the webpage that's blue, you can click. The resources that you have to be able to meet these requirements. There's a wonderful program prepared by the Rhode Island Coastal Resources Center called Prep RI, which will give you 60 minutes of videos about sea level rise and flooding. And that will constitute half of the required training. And then the rest of this page underneath this section right here can give you other resources that can be consulted for finishing the requirement. Basically, a lot of this is reading stuff that's online. And especially if you have board members that don't like to do things online, some of the older board members that we have as volunteers, they're more like, they like hands-on and reading materials. You can refer them to this section if they want to print out hard copies, they certainly can. So we have information on community planning, flood mitigation, general climate adaptation information, green infrastructure, and wastewater information. And as you continue to scroll down the page has all of the enabling laws that we've been talking about today, but also the other laws that are relevant to Rhode Island planning in general. So that's just a call out for how volunteers on planning boards can get their mandatory education completed. And that's basically all I wanted to say on that. So I'll hand it back to you, CJ.
Thanks, Nancy. Thanks for catching me in totally spacing on including that.
No
So again,
problem.
thanks everybody. Thanks everybody for being here with us. Again, we have lots of more time for Q&A this afternoon. We'll get started at 1 p.m. Like I said, we'll be using the same exact webinar, so you can either keep this open or you can close it out and re-click the link at 1. But either way, we hope to see you back here at 1 p.m. And that will also be recorded. So if you can't join us, you will be able to access the recording later. Thanks again, and hope to see you at 1.